Okay, let's dive into this. In all the debates about the conflict in Gaza, there's one question that always seems to pop up, and it's often meant to challenge any criticism. Today, we're not going to answer that question ourselves. Instead, we're going to walk through a specific moral framework from our source material that's designed to do exactly that. And this is it. This is the question. You've probably heard commentators like Piers ask it, and look, it's powerful because it frames Israel's actions as just, necessary, like there are no other options. The source material we're digging into today takes this question head-on and actually builds a structured way to think about an answer. So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with that big question, then introduce a moral framework called the survival cooperation ethic. After that, we'll look at a really interesting historical case study to see how it works, and then we'll apply it to the current situation using 6 specific tests. And finally, we'll see what kind of answer this framework gives us. Right, so this question, it really cuts to the core of the public debate, because it implies there are no other viable alternatives on the table. But the source material we're looking at today, it challenges that very idea by creating a clear, ethical measuring stick we can use to analyze the whole situation. So what is this measuring stick? Well, it's called the survival cooperation ethic, or SCE for short, and it's a theory that suggests morality isn't just one rigid set of rules. Instead, it operates in 2 very different modes, all depending on the circumstances. So, what's the big idea behind SCE? At its core, it's this. In our normal, day-to-day lives, morality is all about cooperation. Being fair, compassionate, building trust. But in a real emergency, an existential threat like a war, morality has to shift. It goes into this flexible survival mode, where actions that would normally be unthinkable might suddenly become necessary. And this is where it gets really interesting. You've got your rules for peacetime on one side and the rules for survival on the other. But, and this is the absolute crucial point from the source, that survival mode has to be temporary. It's like an emergency break glass situation. Eventually, it must pivot back to cooperation. The source argues that if it doesn't, it completely loses its moral justification. Okay, so that's the theory. But to really get it, you gotta see how it works in the real world. For that, our source points to a perfect historical case study, the United States, both during and after World War II. So the analysis goes something like this. First, the US fought a brutal total war. No question, that was pure survival mode. But then came the critical moment, the pivot point. Victory was secured. Now, at that exact moment, instead of just continuing to punish its enemies, the US shifted gears completely. It launched the Marshall Plan, actively rebuilding the very countries it had just been at war with. That was the mandatory return to cooperation. And this right here is the key takeaway from the source's point of view. It wasn't just winning the war that gave the US its moral authority afterwards. It was that deliberate, strategic, and, expensive pivot back to building a cooperative future. The survival mode was temporary, and it served a higher purpose, getting back to a state of cooperation. All right, so we've got the theory, we've got the historical precedent. Now the source material takes this exact same logic and applies it to the current conflict in Gaza. And it does this using 6 very specific survival tests that come straight from the survival cooperation ethic. Let's break this down, because this table really lays out the source's direct comparison. If you look at the World War II column, you see clear endpoints and a vision for the future, like the Marshall Plan, right? It turned enemies into allies, and it boosted America's moral standing. Now look at the Gaza column. The source argues that you're seeing the opposite pattern emerge, an undefined, maybe endless war with no clear plan for restoration. It claims this approach winds up punishing the entire population. It burns the bridges needed for any future cooperation, and ultimately, it erodes moral legitimacy. The fundamental contrast, according to this source, is between a temporary survival action that leads to a better peace and one that doesn't. The source then brings in one final piece of evidence that it finds especially revealing. It makes the case that if this war is truly only about defeating Hamas, then the real test of Israel's intentions isn't actually in Gaza, it's in the West Bank. And this is the question the source poses as the ultimate moral litmus test. I mean, think about it. The West Bank is governed by the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas. So according to this SCE framework, that territory offered a perfect opportunity for Israel to show its commitment to a cooperative future. So what could have been done? Well, the source suggests Israel could have empowered the West Bank, expanded freedoms, and shown a clear path for Palestinians toward dignity and progress, a real alternative to Hamas. This, it argues, would have proven the war was about survival, not about domination. Instead, the source claims Israel has actually increased checkpoints, settlements, and suppression in the West Bank, which it reads as a failure of this crucial moral test. Okay, so let's bring this all the way back home. Now that we're equipped with this whole framework, the survival cooperation ethic, the WWI example, the 6 tests, we can finally construct the source's answer to that question we started with. So when you're asked, well, what do you expect Israel to do? This framework provides a pretty direct response. It says Israel should fight Hamas, absolutely, but it must also fight for a future. What does that mean? It means defining a clear end to the war, announcing a kind of Marshall Plan for Gaza, doing more to protect civilians, and using the West Bank to prove that a cooperative path is actually possible. And these aren't just random suggestions. They are the logical requirements of a moral war according to this specific ethical system. And that's really the bottom line of this whole framework. Survival is a legitimate goal, of course, but it can't be the only goal. For an action to be moral within this system, the temporary, brutal things you have to do to survive must be explicitly linked to an eventual, real return to cooperation. The means of war have to serve an end of peace. And that brings us to the source's final, pretty provocative thought. The framework warns that a constant state of emergency, a perpetual survival mode, it's just not sustainable. It argues that when a fight for survival has no endpoint, no vision for what comes next, it risks consuming the very morality it claims it's trying to defend. So here's a question to leave you with. Does a war need a clear vision for peace to be considered just?